move to our next speaker, Dr. Cheryl Grady from University of Toronto. And Cheryl will tell us about age differences in the dynamic flexibility of brain activity and functional connectivity.
Thank you, Naftali, and my thanks for the invitation to speak to you, and I hope that my voice will hold out through my talk. Fortunately, it's only 15 minutes. So in my work, in my lab, we've all become much more interested and convinced that flexible and dynamic brain activity is something that we should be interested in, particularly in the context of aging. And I think it's reasonable to assume that if our cognition is very complex and needs to change from moment to moment, then our brain activity also should be very complex and flexible and change from moment to moment. And there's actually quite a bit of evidence accumulating that the complexity of brain activity and variability in brain activity actually may facilitate one's ability to flexibly move from one cognitive state to another, and that this sort of dynamic or flexible variable brain activity is a good thing for optimal brain function. So when considering dynamic brain activity in older adults, and pretty much everything we do in terms of functional neuroimaging in older adults, I think we have to keep in mind that there are a number of processes that appear to be quite important, and you've heard about some of them already, such as compensation, cognitive reserve, resilience. I'm also going to be talking about another one which we haven't mentioned yet, which is dedifferentiation. And in younger adults, if you have them do a particular task in an fMRI scanner, and then you have them do something else, their brain activity is very distinct from one cognitive activity to another. So it's differentiated, so to speak. In older adults, this is not necessarily the case. So dedifferentiation then is a reduction in the selective activity in one type of cognitive process to another, or viewing one kind of stimulus versus another. And my first example is going to be dedifferentiation. So I'm going to give you two examples. The first one is looking at task dynamics. So here we're looking at selectivity of brain activity for different types of cognitive processing. And I think this will be an example both of dedifferentiation and maintenance of function. I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive at all. The second example is connection dynamics. So I'll give you some data on functional connectivity at rest. And I think this particular example may be a potential example of cognitive reserve. And why I say potential, we'll get to when we get there. However, in order to interpret all of these age differences that we see in functional neuroimaging, we have to relate them back to cognitive performance to try and figure out whether or not these changes are adaptive. So, first example. We know that older adults show reductions in some kinds of memory function, but not others. So one of the types of memory that seems to be reduced pretty robustly in older adults is what we call associative memory, which involves either binding two objects together or maybe an object in some sort of context. So it's a rather complicated form of memory. Older adults have reductions in this form of memory. But if you ask older adults just to remember single items, like single words or maybe single pictures of objects, they can usually do that pretty well. As I mentioned, older adults, in terms of brain activity, also show dedifferentiation in a variety of tests. So we've been interested to look to see whether these two things are related. So is the differentiation of activity that you see during a particular type of cognitive processing related to how well older adults will perform later on some task? So in several experiments, we've looked at this in the context of memory. I only have time to show you one. And we're going to be looking to see whether selective brain activity is important for, particularly for associative memory, which is the kind of memory that older adults have trouble with. So in this particular experiment, we had our subjects, this was an fMRI study. They saw a series of objects, pictures of objects or pictures of houses, one at a time, and they simply had to make a judgment about the objects in the houses. That was what we call an item encoding scan. There was another one where they saw two things now, an object and a house, and in order to try and get them to put those two things together, we asked them whether or not they thought that object would be found in that particular house. So we have an item encoding session and an associative encoding session. Over on the right, you see what the memory looked like after the scanning session was done. For item memory, the single pictures of objects or houses, there was no age difference. for associative memory, where they're now trying to remember the pairs of items together, there was an age reduction. So our question here is how selective activity during item encoding versus associative encoding might be related to later memory. So do those individuals who have more predictable or more differentiated activity during associative encoding, particularly the older adults, are they the ones that will perform better? So we're looking here at being able to predict whether or not individuals are viewing the items or viewing the associative encoding pairs. These graphs show the actual prediction probability. You can see that this was an event-related study, and so you can see that the prediction probability curves actually look quite a bit like what the hemodynamic activity curves would look like. So prediction rises up to a point and then starts to fall off. The item encoding prediction was similar in younger and older adults, so there was no age difference. There was an age difference for associative encoding, which you can see over on the right. The older adults' brains during that particular processing run were much less predictable or distinctive than younger adults. But does this have anything to do with behavior? Whoops. I'll get to that in a minute. First of all, I want to show you what the brain patterns looked like. At the top here, we see the patterns that were predictive of item encoding in both young and older adults. This was generally occipital visual regions. On the bottom, we see the areas that were predictive of associative encoding in the young, but not so much in the old. You see that the older adults basically aren't showing any differentiation in activity for this particular pattern for associative encoding. In terms of behavior, we found that after accounting for age, that actually both in young and older adults, the distinctive activity in their brains during the initial viewing of those object pairs was associated with how well they were able to remember them afterwards. So in this case, we have a situation where the older adults are less differentiated than younger adults. On the other hand, those older adults who seem to be more differentiated or maintain that differentiated pattern show better memory. But again, getting back to what we were talking about earlier, this is something which seems to be important throughout the lifespan. And what happens is that older adults just become less differentiated in their activity over time, but those who can maintain it will do better. So my second example is connection dynamics. So there's been a lot of work recently looking at brain networks. There are a variety of different ways in which people have defined these brain networks. Unfortunately, at the moment, there's no real gold standard for how many brain networks there are, what they actually do. But there seems to be at least some consensus that there are at least a few brain networks that everyone seems to agree are important. And you heard a little bit from Jakov's talk about the default network and task-positive networks. And we've been particularly interested, at least in some of our work, in three of these networks. One is the default network, which Jakov mentioned. This is a network which is more active when people are engaged in internal type processing, self-referent type of tasks, autobiographical memory retrieval, that sort of thing. So it's sort of an internally focused network. On the other hand, there's the dorsal attention network, which is more of an externally focused network. So if you need to focus on something out there in the world, then the dorsal attention network is more of a goal-directed and externally focused network. There's some idea that in between those two networks, there's a third one called the frontal parietal control network, which may actually function as a switch, which turns these other networks on and off. And our idea has been that if this frontal parietal control network actually is a switch, then maybe it's very important in cognitive aging. So maybe there's something about the frontal parietal control network that works differently in older versus younger adults. And so that's what we were looking at in the next experiment that I'm going to show you. So we had a group of younger adults and older adults. These graphs that you see here are depictions of what the networks look like, those three networks look like in young and older adults. So the blue is the default, the red is the dorsal attention, and the green is the frontal parietal control. You see that the green is indeed in the middle between the other two, which is interesting because if it acts as a switch, that's sort of where it should be, perhaps. In general, though, the structure of these networks looks fairly similar between young and older adults. Although one of the things that we see here, and that other people have also shown, is that if you look at within network connections in younger adults and older adults, often older adults have weaker connections within the various networks. On the other hand, they have stronger connections between networks. And this is also what we saw here. So over here, you can see that particularly for the frontal parietal control network, there are more connections both in younger and older adults involving this network, which is what you would expect if it is in fact a switch, but this is particularly true for the older adults. So reduced within, but strengthened between network connections. So does that strengthening of the frontal parietal control network have any impact on what's happening elsewhere? Well, what you see here is a graph showing the relation between the between-network connections for the frontal parietal control network and the within-network connections for the default mode. And only in the older adults, you see that those older adults with weaker connections within the default mode network have stronger connectivity involving between-network connections of the frontal parietal control network. So we can't say here whether or not this actually is a mechanism of cognitive reserve. It's tempting to at least speculate that perhaps this increase in connections involving the between networks involving the frontal parietal control might be in response to a weakening of the default network. We can't say that at this point, which is why I was saying it's a potential mechanism perhaps for cognitive reserve. And again, does this have anything to do with performance? So similar to what I showed you before, what we found here is that indeed the connections, between network connections of the frontal parietal control network, as they increased during rest, there was an increase in a memory performance during the task. This actually was a combination of several different experiments that we put together, so it actually was more than one type of memory we were looking at here. But nevertheless, again, in younger and older adults, stronger connectivity involving the frontal parietal control network, even at rest, was associated with how good their memory was, suggesting that, again, this is something which is probably there throughout life, but maybe has more importance as we get older. So, to conclude, we have found in a number of situations now that there are robust age differences in the dynamic range of brain activity. I've showed you some evidence there is reduced task selectivity, which seems to be related primarily to those kinds of memory performance that older adults have trouble with. So we've also found that there seems to be more dedifferentiation during memory retrieval as well as encoding, particularly for those kinds of memories that older adults have problems retrieving. So those older adults who seem to be better able to maintain this type of differentiated brain activity seem to be the ones who have the better memory performance. Also, in terms of connectivity, we found that increased integration of the frontal parietal control network at rest seems to predict functional connectivity within the default mode as well as memory performance, which indicates that it may be a mechanism of cognitive reserve. So it seems as if dynamic brain activity is related to cognitive performance, and that when there's a reduction in dynamic brain activity, this particular kind of flexible brain function, it seems to be an important neural correlate of age differences in cognition that we need to pay attention to. And this is just to thank the people who actually either did the work or collaborated with me on it, and the nice people who gave me the money to do it. Thank you.
Time for questions, please. Roberto.
Yeah, that's a bit loudly. So, what do you relate the increase in network connectivity across networks to reserve rather than compensation?
In case you didn't hear it, he was asking me, and thank you for that question, Roberto. He was asking me why I was calling it cognitive reserve instead of compensation. I think generally what I have tended to do over the years is to refer or interpret compensation when there's something in older adults that is really different from what we see in younger adults. So if they either are using a different set of brain regions or a different network or something, and that particular usage is usually pretty restricted to just what's happening in older adults. I didn't use the word compensation here because, as I pointed out, the kinds of relations that we were seeing were there both in young and in old. So that's why I was calling it reserve, in the sense of something which has been there all along, and it just perhaps become more important when we get older. Although I do also think that one thing that's really lacking in this field, and I'm hoping that in our meeting in Montreal later this spring, we'll actually work some of this out. One of the problems is that we don't, I don't think, have really hard, good definitions for what we call reserve versus compensation and some of these other terms. So I mentioned this meeting in Montreal, so some of us are having a meeting later in May in Montreal where we're actually going to try and work out what we should actually define these things as. So hopefully after that we'll have somewhat a better idea, but I think that's also one of the issues, is that we don't quite know what to call these things sometimes. But the reason why I didn't call it compensation is mainly based on that.
Cheryl, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So, could your young people be sort of on the trajectory to get Alzheimer's disease? Do you have any other measurements in them? Those that show dedifferentiated, or dedifferentiated
We do not.
brains?
So we don't have, for example, amyloid imaging or anything like that on our subjects. So we don't actually know.
The idea that it's throughout life in some people, well, is that a disease, is that some people, or is that really, amyloid or Alzheimer's disease free?
Yeah, I think that's also a really good question, and unfortunately we just don't know that in these participants. But I think that's really the kind of question that needs to be addressed just across the adult lifespan, is what do younger adults look like? I mean, generally they don't tend to show amyloid, for example. But there are some studies showing that, for example, I think ApoE4 in younger adults has some interesting impact on their cognition. So clearly these things are not things that just happen one day and you wake up, you're 65, and all of a sudden you have this problem. A lot of these things are there even when you're younger, and they're just sort of through life experience and all these other things, genetics and exercise and whatever. I think they just become more important when you're older. Yes? Oh.
On? Yeah.
Ah, there you go.
Could it be that one of the main reasons we have a hard time wrapping our heads around compensation is that it really needs to be a longitudinal question? We can only compensate for our own pathophysiology, right? And so you can think of cognitive reserve as building through a lifespan, so maybe cross-sectional designs can speak to that a little bit more, but within myself, I'm only compensating for how good I used to be a few years ago, right? So maybe more and more longitudinal data will help tease these apart, maybe?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's one of the things we really need, is more longitudinal data. I mean, ideally, I would like to see it starting from childhood up to older age, but I think you're absolutely right, is that we can't really probably get a good handle on whether someone is compensating for something unless we know what they were like, 10 years, 20 years before. Yeah, absolutely.